Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
Hey friends, we are here today with Kat Armas. She is the author of Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength, which was published in 2021. And before we stop today, I want to ask her about her new book, but we won't get to that yet. Kat has an MDiv and a Master's of Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. She's a Cuban-American writer and speaker. She hosts the Protagonistas podcast, where she highlights stories of everyday women of color, including writers, pastors, church leaders, and theologians. She has written for Christianity Today, Sojourners, Relevant Christians for Biblical Equality, Fuller Youth Institute, Fathom Magazine, and Missio Alliance. She also works on the Living a Better Story project at the Fuller Youth Institute and speaks regularly at conferences on race and justice. And the way that I made this great discovery of Kat Armas is I make a point of reading books by women, probably maybe 30 books by women every year, but certainly at least 2/3 of those are by women of color. And so my algorithms are set for recommendations. And, this popped up some time ago, last summer, I guess, and I just went right through it. And so I would like for Kat to tell some of her story, even though it is something of a memoir when you read the book. But please introduce us to why you wrote this, what you are about, and what is it about, Kat?
Yes, well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I love that your algorithm does the work for you. You don't need to do any of the extra work. I think that's the way it should be. We talk about all the horrors of the internet, but hey, if we got good algorithms, I think it's super helpful.
So true. So
yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm Cuban American and I'm originally from Miami, Florida. And I always make sure to specify that because that, is really what my book is stemmed upon my experiences growing up in a culture where my culture was the dominant culture, right? I mean, growing up in Miami, it's primarily made up of Latinos, but, mostly Cuban Americans. And obviously that's changing as the years, change and as we get further and further from the Cuban Revolution. But yeah, I mean, it was just a predominantly Latinx area. And so, like I said, my culture was the dominant culture. And I was raised by a single mother and a single grandmother in an immigrant Roman Catholic community. And so that really shaped how I understood and how I understand the world. My grandmother and my mother were both mother and father, right? Providers for me. They taught me how to be assertive and stand up for myself and all of the things that, a single mother would teach her daughter and also her granddaughter. And also coming from an immigrant Roman Catholic community, the sacraments were such a big part of my life and the saints and, altars and all of these, physical, right? And as for something I love about the sacraments and something I love about Catholicism really is just the materiality when it comes to, spirituality. Like I said, the altars and the saints and, the rosaries and everything, you touch these things with your hands and you hold, these things things are you kneel down, when you come to an altar and you place physical things there. And I think that was all such a big part of how I understood my spirituality. And I think that was a big part of how I understood just the spirituality of my community, and how, I talk about an Abuelita Faith, and how I would go visit, my grandmother's friends, and they would have these big statues of San Lazaro, which was the patron saint of the Cubans. And it was scary for me as a child sometimes, you see Lazaro's wounds and the dog licking his wounds. But I think for me, it really spoke to the hope of a community, and just the physical, what physical signs or things they needed in order to remain hopeful and find strength. And so, yeah. And it wasn't until I left, my setting, my Cuban haven of Miami, to enter the subculture of white evangelicalism in the South, that, I just was met with like many, existential crises, I would say. First of all, being a woman, right? Being a woman in a context in which women were told to be submissive, and, that men must lead them, where I never experienced that because I was raised again by single, women, where I never had a man that I had to submit to, really. And also that, and just, the overall, racist and sexist and all the things that come with being in that culture as a Cuban woman, as a woman. And so that's really where I began to wrestle with this idea of Abuelita theology, or an Abuelita faith, when so much of what I was being taught by the white man at the pulpit with the suits and the quote unquote right theology was just not fitting with my lived experience, and not just mine, but the lived experiences of everybody in my community. It just did not make sense. So what I began to wrestle is everyone, and the faith of my ancestors, the faith of my community, is all of that wrong? Is all of that, not right, not genuine, not true? And I was legitimately being told that it wasn't. I was legitimately being told that no, I needed to evangelize, save my grandmother, who was just so dedicated to the church and so dedicated to her faith, albeit it did not look the way that white evangelicalism said it must look like. So that was, just my sparkling and what sparked my wrestling with this idea of like, well, wait a minute, what if, the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those whom the world wouldn't consider theologians? White evangelicalism would not consider my abuela a genuine theologian. She was not educated, by Western standards. She didn't have past a elementary school education. She grew up in the countryside, and she was an immigrant. When she got to this country, she didn't know the language. She was poor. She was a widow. All of these realities that marginalized her, and she would never be considered a genuine theologian. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I think she is the greatest theologian, and not just her, but women like her. So yeah, that's what Abuelita Faith, where it came from, and really what it's about.
Boy, this is, I connect with your story so well. And, I'm not Cuban American. I just connect with it that, when you talked about San Lazaro, Lazarus is a big figure in African American preaching. One of our leading preachers one year, he preached, and it was recorded and kind of went, at least at that time, the closest thing to viral, pre-internet, but it still resonates with a lot of people, called Treat Lazarus Right. That was the title of the sermon. And so I connect with that. And also your perception, or at least how you were being led to perceive Roman Catholicism. I can remember in my days where my mind was still under the influence of whiteness. I remember my friend and I, we would go to Santa Clara Church, and we would pass out tracts to the people coming to Mass so that they could get saved, which leads me to... Well, yeah, go ahead. Weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, which is just so twisted, right? And so what a contorted and twisted. I mean, not just you, it's just what we believe in.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was saying led to, these existential crises. Because imagine, I mean, that's all I knew about faith, about God. And I'm being told that, my entire community, my entire belief system, everything I know about myself, I was deceived, right? I was deceived by the devil. And that really, I mean, that is a form of trauma. When you think about it, right?
Oh, yeah.
To believe that
Yeah.
that everything that you've ever known about yourself and about spirituality is a deception of the devil. I mean, that is really twisted, right? So anyways, I'm totally with you.
So let me ask, do you feel in some ways that your journey through, a manipulative kind of faith has permanently scarred you in some way?
So that's a great question. And I think about this a lot because I think I was spared in some way because I was not raised in white evangelicalism, right? I think a lot of people, it's like, you have this awakening 30, 40, whatever years later, and it feels like, for example, my spouse, he was raised in this context. And so when his eyes started opening to it, he felt like I lost so much of my life. I lost so much of my childhood. I lost so much of my whatever years and years. Whereas I think for me, because I stepped into, I sort of fumbled my way into evangelicalism in my early 20s. And it wasn't many, many years before. I mean, it was maybe 2-3 years, maybe 4 years. So, it wasn't very long before I realized, wait a minute, something is off. Like this does not compute type of thing, and that happened fairly quickly. And I think because of the fact that I was raised in the context that I was raised in by the women that I was raised by, I think that I wasn't as jaded by many folks, understandably, who are jaded. I mean, I completely understand the jadedness. And so I think that was helpful for me. And so I was able to step out of it and see all of the things that a lot of folks around me, because they were raised in it, couldn't see. And by that, I just mean when I, was attending seminary in the subculture of white evangelicalism, a lot of the friends that I made were white, raised in that context at that time. And, I was seeing things that they were like, well, what are you talking about? Like I was using the word cult back then, and people were like, what? How dare you use that word? But I was like, no, you need to say that this is a cult, So anyway, I think, it was, I had that sort of advantage, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. I have thought that. I don't know how much I've actually said it, but you articulated it. You identified it as a cult. And, I think it's become quite manifest these days that it is, but can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, I'm glad that you asked me to specify that. Now, I haven't thought through this too much or read too much on like what an actual cult is. So I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, although I will say there are cultish tendencies, right?
But Kat, you say you have not studied what a cult is, but the definition of a cult was probably framed by somebody who was a part of that cult.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I guess I would say this idea of power and the idea of authority and how it's wielded by one person or one group of people with power and authority to subjugate and keep people subjugated by their way of thinking, their way of being, their way of knowing. That's sort of my understanding of it. And so when I say that, I was using that word back then, I was in a small church, a church plant. And I wrote about this in Abuelita Faith, but the pastor, began saying that I was quote unquote unsubmissive because I reached out to a bunch of women to read the Bible with them, and back then that was so important to me, right? Quote unquote discipleship. And so I was just doing what I believed what I needed to do as a follower of Jesus. I was discipling women, right? And it was just reading the Bible. It wasn't, and I was in seminary. I felt like I was someone that wasn't out of nowhere to like not be trusted. And I was a faithful person in this church, but I didn't ask the pastor for permission to do this. And therefore I was unsubmissive to his authority. And so it was in that context that I was using, that word cult, it was very much that we needed to submit to this man, who can tell us, what we can do or what we can't do. Or, he was playing this godlike figure. Like it was as if he was God, And I remember one time I went to like this interfaith gathering, and, I was just meeting people and hanging out with people, and they were so alarmed that I went to this interfaith gathering, and they said that I committed a sin of omission because I did not tell the church that I was going to do this. Things like that, that I'm like, that is cultish, right? Like that is a cult. So it was just, and again, it's when people feel threatened. And again, I was a woman. I was not a white woman in the way that they understand whiteness. And I was not from their culture. I was not from their, and here I am, doing things that are outside of what submissive, women would do. And that's ask for permission or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
And so, I was in that context where I'm like, guys, this is a cult. We must submit to this man's authority in ways that are not asked of us in scripture or in just anywhere,
As you say that, you reminded me of an experience I had several years ago in Toronto. I was in fact invited to make a presentation at the Parliament of the World's Religions. And I remember I made my presentation as though I were preaching to the choir. And then when it was over, when I opened the floor, I got cordial pushback from people, finding out later that there were several white evangelicals who were attending this. But I never expected, because I had a similar, background to yours in some ways, that they would even register for something like this, without the motivation to come and getting everybody saved.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, I quoted you back in during Black History Month. Actually, I made a couple of speeches for a couple of events here in Southern California. And I want to just read to you what I was saying and how I used your words to illuminate what I was saying.
Oh, I would love to hear that. Yeah.
Okay. So I said, like many of us, this God has caused people who have been trampled upon to ask questions about the faith system they were sold because it has not worked for them. Cuban-American writer and podcaster Kat Armas asked herself, can this Christ, the one who has infiltrated much of our theology and mission efforts, the Christ who is white, elite, and of European descent, be redeemed? Is this the Jesus who saved me? Or could there be another Christ? So I felt that was particularly relevant to I think the thinking of so many people who are churched and they're still, they're finding their way. They're trying to figure out who is Jesus and what have I experienced in fact. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, well, I'm honored that you would quote me in your speech, particularly in Black History Month. So thank you for that. But I feel like for me, it really was this meeting a new Jesus. In Abuelita Faith, I talk about, and I quote Miguel de la Torre on this, but Jesus of los humildes, Jesus of the humble, right? And there really is like these two Christs that we come into contact with. There is the Jesus that is white, elite, right? The one that comes like in the on the horse with the weapons and, whatever, the one that wants to destroy and rule, and the powerful Jesus. And then there's the one that, that's in the Bible, which is just so interesting because that Jesus that begins in the manger sort of becomes this warrior Christ, right? He kind of transforms, and I do believe a large part of that is because a lot of the Western Church reads Scripture as if they're Israel, when the Western Church is not Israel. The Western Church is Babylon or Egypt or one of the oppressive empires, right? But we have so convinced ourselves that we are, marginalized and oppressed Israel, and that we must, fight back the oppressors, when it's like, well, maybe if we actually saw ourselves in the position that we are actually in, and that is oppressive, Egypt. But anyway, and I sort of like came in contact with this Jesus of los humildes. And when I began to, see Jesus through the context of my abuela, through the context of my community, and realizing that the Jesus that my community, the Jesus that my abuela trusts in is not the powerful, elite coming on a white horse Jesus. I mean, it is the Jesus that meets her at the well. As I talk about in Abuelita Faith, a lot of, our marginalized abuelitas, a lot of our, these people, these people like my grandmother and her community, they don't have to work very hard to see themselves in the story, right? Like when Abuela reads the story of the woman at the well, she's actually the woman at the well. She doesn't have to envision what it would be like to be the woman at the well. And I think for many of us with varying levels of privilege, and particularly those in the Western church, it takes a lot of imagination to see yourself in these stories because, it's our lived experiences are so different than many of those struggling to survive as our abuelitas do. And so, I was met with these two contrasting Christs. And that's when I realized I need to put to death this ruling, powerful warrior Christ that white evangelicalism had me put my salvation in. That is not the Christ that we see in scripture. That is not the Christ that our abuelitas glean hope and salvation and strength from.
You use the term meeting a new Jesus, and I'm sure in your research, in your studies, you had these thoughts at some point. Has this Jesus always been around, or did this Jesus resurface, in some kind of post-colonial era? So let me ask you, has this Jesus always been present? Has there been a consciousness of this Jesus always?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think and I love that you use, the term post-colonial, because I think in the post-colonial subject, yes, right? I think of, in Abuelita Faith, I write about Gloria Anzaldúa, I write about Gloria Anzaldúa, but I'm thinking of the Guatemalan activist. So Rigoberta Menchú, she's a Guatemalan activist, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize. And
right.
Yeah, in Abuelita Faith, I talk about how, she was part of the indigenous, or she is an indigenous Guatemalan. And in her story during the Guatemalan Civil War, you had the oppressors, literally backed with U.S., weaponry, backed by the U.S. You had the oppressors who, came in and were literally trying to drive out the indigenous people in order to take their land. Their land is resource, quote unquote, is, whatever. And she wanted to read the Bible because she wanted to understand the mindset and the thought process of her oppressors.
Wow.
So she read the Bible because she was like, well, this is the book that my oppressors read. Let me try and understand their thinking. And in that, she read the story of David and Goliath, and she thought, wait a minute, I am David. We are David. Like this, and the Bible inspired her to, fight back, and inspired her to take the position of her marginalized community. And so they literally did. They stood their ground and they fought back against the oppressors thanks to her reading the Bible. And so I do think that to the post-colonial subject, and it's hard to say because they have always been met by the white Jesus. They've always been met. That is, Catholicism has infiltrated Latin America, and you have right now so much of their religiosity is a coming together of an indigenous God, of a local native religion, and also of a white, Catholic. Even I would say my grandmother's faith. She knew white Jesus through the Catholicism that was introduced to her, but they made it their own, right? That's where you have so many of these saints that are subversive in their own ways.
Yes.
And so I think it's muddy, it's muddled, I think, but because of the way that so many of our marginalized siblings, privilege doesn't cushion them to, in many ways, that cushion of privilege is removed, and they can see the genuine Jesus of los humildes in a way that many who carry varying levels of privilege cannot. And so I think that Jesus, to answer your question, has always existed and does exist in the imagination of the colonized person. But I do think that, it does take, and particularly for those of us in the West, or those of us who have been introduced to white Jesus, it does take some removing of, the whatever you want to call it. We have to sort of take that extra baggage off in order to see it, because we have been so indoctrinated. Because that's what imperialism and colonialism does. It indoctrinates. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. As you're talking, and I think of, I don't know if you're familiar with St. Peter Claver, but
Not, no, go ahead. I would love to hear more.
He was in the 16th and 17th centuries and is the patron saint of African missions and interracial justice. He was born in Spain and had this vision, because when we are immersed in a certain kind of religion, that's all we know, and we think that that's the way our reality should function. And so,
totally.
That's how he came up in Spain, dreaming that the best thing he could be was a missionary. And so as a priest, he came to Cartagena, and he was appalled at when he encountered the African slaves there.
Right.
That he said, I didn't know this is what I was signing up for.
Right. Yeah.
So he would go on into the holds of ships and put ointment on the wounds where the where the chains had damaged the flesh of the Africans. And he would, if he found out that there was someone involved in the slave trade, he would not take confession from them. And so he became, in some way, something of a revolutionary, because his consciousness of Jesus, his imagination of Jesus, during a very, very dark experience, still shone brightly in a colonizing effort and religion. And I think that's kind of what you were raising when you talked about how your abuelita, how she experienced Jesus in spite of everything, right?
Right. Definitely. Yeah. And I think, that's where these liberation movements began, right? You had someone like Oscar Romero, who the same thing, he was like, wait a minute, the poor, here I am living amongst the poor of El Salvador. And, a lot of this is not lining up with the religiosity of what I'm, supposed to be, how I'm living, or how the church is living, and the actual poor in front of me. And so, yeah, I think, I love that you use the word consciousness, because I think that's what it is. There is a consciousness within us. But I think in white evangelicalism, so many of us have been trained to ignore that, right? We've been trained to, not listen to our own minds, our own hearts, because they can deceive and they are wicked. And so a lot of us push aside, that which almost is like common sense, right? I always say that white evangelicalism, believes the Bible is literal, right? In every aspect of the word, except for all the things Jesus said about liberation and the poor. All of that is spiritual, right? And I think that that's part of what keeps us subjugated is, when we can separate mind and body, when we can, there's so many chasms. And I talk about this in the beginning of Abuelita Faith, how there was such a wide chasm between what I was told to believe, but what my lived experience was, and, what I actually witnessed in my community, but what I was literally told was reality. It was like a form of gaslighting. And then all of a sudden this chasm starts to narrow, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, there isn't this separation between mind and body. And all of it is together, and all of it is, it's all part of what it means to be a human, and what it means to trust and believe in God. And I think that's what I'm arguing in Abuelita Faith, that all of the things of which we need to do to survive is theology. And by that, I mean, and of course I look at my grandmother's life and I say, how did my grandmother survive? Well, she provided for us by literally making clothes with her hands, and she made food with her hands, and she gardened with her body, and she danced. And that's how she found liberation and joy, through dancing with her body. And all of this is she used every single part of herself. And that is theology. And now white evangelicalism has told us that only that which we do with our minds is theology. But I'm saying, no, I don't think though. That's not how it is for the majority of the world.
Yeah, you just highlighted, I think, part of the Black church experience. Dancing has been such a huge part of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the dance is saying more than the sermon said, about liberation, about joy in spite of what's going on.
Right.
And so
right.
I can appreciate, that aspect of your story, of your journey. And honestly, you give me hope. As your elder, I like to think that there are lights shining in these dark times. And I'm wondering if tell me what your vision for church and Christianity might be in this era.
Yeah. Well, I think I love the verse in I think Jesus says it. I don't remember, but everything that is in the darkness will come to light, right? Like all of the darkness will be exposed.
Love it.
And yeah, I think that that's so good, because I think that's a lot of what is happening, and it's been happening. I mean, I don't think anything is new. I think people have been exposing the darkness, forever. I mean, different groups of people at different points of time. But I think what's particularly happening in white evangelicalism right now, there is a lot of that. There is a lot of exposing of darkness, and people are, decolonizing and deconstructing and all the and all the, doing all the things. And, I am hopeful about it. Now, I think what is difficult is when you're coming up against empire. I always say that empire is all about the facade, right? Empire is all about, it's a farce, but it's all about the image that it puts up. It's all about the image of, prosperity, and the image of peace, and the image of, all these images. But I think that, one thing that one of my professor once said that I think about it all the time is that when empire is met with resistance, it loses its authority. And I think that if we're just committed to the notion of resistance, I think empire will continue to lose its authority. And how we're understanding it and seeing it right now. And I think if we just continue to resist and persist, and you've seen it throughout history. I mean, that's something that I wanted to write about in Abuelita Faith. How have women resisted and persisted in their resistance? And how has that changed the course of history? And it has. I mean, talking about the civil rights movement, Joanne Robinson, and, the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, if it wasn't for this woman and these women who committed to their resistance and their persistence, I mean, they changed the course of history. And I think the same thing with, women who did the same in Latin America, who resisted against dictators and against empires and changed the course of history. And women in the Bible. I mean, you have Rizpah, who, we hear about her, 2 sentences in 2 Samuel. But if you really read her story, it was her protest, it was her persistence at the unjust murders of her sons that caused literally a famine to end. I mean, there was a famine, and it was because of what she did that God sent rain. And I love that, because nobody talks about that, because it's a subversive sort of resistance, and it's a subversive sort of persistence that seems like it's behind the scenes, but it just changes history. And so I'm seeing that now. I've seen that throughout history, as King Solomon says, what has been will be, there is nothing new under the sun, and we will continue to see empire be empire. But I think we will continue to see, those of us just continue to rise up and resist and persist and watch empire lose its authority little by little.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at God is not an asshole, or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.